So with Visual Studio 2012, we get a first-class development experience with SharePoint 2013. We first had that actually in Visual Studio 2010. Before that, previous versions of Visual Studio, you had to do everything by hand. So all of the SharePoint items are heavily dependent on XML configuration files such as CAML. And so there was a lot of times where it was a lot of painstakingly copying code from different XML snippets into your project, or doing it by hand. So that's over now. That actually ended with Visual Studio 2010, and then Visual Studio 2012. It actually just gets better and better. So now there's even more improved project item templates, new project item templates, improved visual designers for packages, features, visual web parts. We have full build and deploy management. The debugging is still a good integrated experience. You have support for farm and sandbox solutions. There is also support for apps, but we're not going to cover that right now. And then there's other refinements. So with Visual Studio 2012, the project templates for SharePoint have changed a little bit. So obviously there's templates that are targeted for SharePoint 2013, and there's also some for SharePoint 2010. But the big difference is the choices have actually gone down quite a bit. So you still have project templates for the web parts, for Silverlight web part, Visual web part, and you have one for a workflow, just for importing a reusable workflow. And then obviously there's the empty SharePoint project, and then the import SharePoint solution package. And then there's the SharePoint 2010 project templates. So, and those are the same as 2013. So what Microsoft has done, it seems like we're kind of being guided to use the empty SharePoint projects. And then there's quite a few more project items that have been added. So when you create a new SharePoint project in Visual Studio 2012, you're going to specify a site for deployment and debugging, and it has to be on the same machine as Visual Studio. When you're doing a farm solution or a sandbox solution, it has to be on the same machine. Your workstation needs to have SharePoint running on it as well as Visual Studio. And you have to specify a deployment type, either sandbox or farm. And now with when you choose sandbox, there's a little bit more smarts built into Visual Studio. It used to be where if you chose a sandbox project and you added some items to it that were incompatible with the sandbox, you wouldn't be you could add them, and then you would get runtime errors, or you could have code that was unsafe and you would get runtime errors. But now a lot of smarts for that have been built into Visual Studio to prevent that from happening in the first place. Also, a nice thing that's changed a little bit in Visual Studio 2012 is you're still required to run as administrator when you're working on SharePoint projects, but Visual Studio will actually detect if you're not running as administrator when you try to create a SharePoint project, and it'll prompt you to restart, and it'll elevate your privileges so you are running as an administrator. Another thing to remember is that if you're building a test application, like a console application or something like that, you need to make sure that the target that you have in the build for Visual Studio is for any CPU. And then another thing is you have to make sure that you don't accidentally choose the client profile when you're creating a project. Otherwise, you won't see the references, won't show you the Microsoft.SharePoint assemblies and all the other Microsoft namespace assemblies. So now we're going to look at creating a SharePoint project in Visual Studio 2012. Okay, I'm going to launch Visual Studio 2012. And we're going to go to New Project, and let's take a look at the choices that we have available here. We have Office, SharePoint, and these are for if you're building an app for SharePoint or for Office 2013 or an Office add-in, and then SharePoint Solutions is under that main category. And so you can see here's all the SharePoint 2013 project templates, and then the SharePoint 2010 project templates. They're all the same. It's just one's targeted for 2013, one's for 2010. So I'm going to choose a 2013 empty project, and notice how it's the first selection. And notice how I didn't start Visual Studio as an administrator, so I'm going to go ahead, and Visual Studio is nice enough to figure it out and say, oh, would you like to start this over again? So now I'm going to do that, and it's elevating the privileges for me, and now I'm starting this up. And now I can go start a new project, choose the empty project, specify this is my local server, and I want to deploy as a farm solution, so I'm going to click Finish. And it's creating the project for me, and it has everything that I need to do SharePoint development. And so now from here I can go and add new items, and if I click on the Office SharePoint items category, you can see all the items that I have available